Following in the vein of its predecessor, Suikoden 3 ended up being well received by fans and critics alike, often being considered one of the best games of the series. Sales were relatively strong in Japan and North America, but sadly our friends in Europe were left out, and Suikoden 3 remains the one game in the series they never got. In the end, it was no surprise when the series continued on the PlayStation 2. Suikoden 4 released on January 11, 2005 in North America, taking place approximately 150 years before the events of the very first Suikoden. So, does Suikoden 4 further improve the foundation set by the other games, or is its reputation as the weakest game in the series well earned? Being chronologically the first game to take place in the series, Suikoden 4 can be played without any prior knowledge of the series, although as usual there are a few references and nods to other Suikoden games. Something worth mentioning is that Suikoden 4 is the first game in the series to not offer any bonuses for loading save data from previous games, which kinda makes sense since the game is a prequel. Set in the island nations, the story follows a young knight living on the island of Razriel and his struggles against the Kulak Empire, a dynasty looking to conquer the island nations. As per series standards, through mysterious circumstances, our hero becomes the bearer for one of the true runes, this time the true rune of punishment. This particular ancient item governs atonement and forgiveness, and is different from other runes that it consumes the life of its bearer with use. Once the previous bearer dies, the rune finds another and continuously repeats this process. So it's up to the hero to gather the 108 stars of destiny, defend the island nations from Kulak, and to possibly look into getting rid of his true rune. As far as stories go in the series, Suikoden 4's feels kinda standard, especially following on the heels of the grand narrative of Suikoden 3. That isn't to say that the plot is poor or uninteresting, it just feels redundant in some regards, especially if you're like me and have been playing all the games by order of release. It doesn't really stand out amongst the stories of the other titles in the series. It also doesn't help that the narrative is quite short. If you stick to the main quest and don't recruit all the characters, Suikoden 4 can easily be beaten in under 20 hours. It feels like by the time you're fully invested in the story and ready for the big twist, the game just ends, which left me unsatisfied with the overall narrative. I know some of you must be thinking, but Darren, you complained about how much of a time investment Suikoden 3 was, and Suikoden 1 was also really short, so why are you complaining? Well, inquisitive commenters, the answer is quite simple. Despite being a short game for RPG standards, Suikoden 4 isn't very well paced. More on that a little later though. As per usual, the 108 stars of destiny are, sorry for the pun, the stars of the story. But because of the short runtime, you'll have next to no time to get to know any of them, making Suikoden 4 have one of the weakest cast of characters in this series. There were only a few characters worth caring about, like the hero's friend, Snow Vingerhut, who undergoes some engaging character development. Sadly, the same can't be said for the majority of the game's cast, but especially the main character. For whatever reason, someone decided that it was too interesting to have a main character with a distinct personality and actual spoken dialogue. As such, Suikoden 4's hero is a silent protagonist and is about as interesting as a burnt piece of toast. Unlike heroes of previous games, our hero absolutely cannot emote, and can often be seen in cutscenes looking lost or like a lifeless doll along for the journey. This issue is best seen when the hero is accused of murder and does absolutely nothing. So, nitpicks aside, I would say that the overall narrative is passable, but lacks any sort of impact due to its brief length and its uneven pacing. The characters aren't uninteresting aside from the main hero, but they are given very little time to develop, resulting in their characterization to feel shallow. After Suikoden 3 practically changed everything, Suikoden 4 has seemingly tried a back-to-basics approach. For instance, the battle system is near identical to the one seen in Suikodens 1 and 2, and thankfully players have full control of each party member, but at the cost of the size of your traveling party. For the first time in the series, the max party size is 4. This reduced capacity for traveling companions means that you will have access to less unite attacks and party combinations, making Suikoden 4 feel a bit more like a typical RPG. I always liked having parties of 6 since it felt like I was in charge of a small army unit rather than a group of adventurers. The skill system introduced in Suikoden 3 is missing, which I think is an absolute shame. There is a new battle command called Rush, in which your party will heal the leader and perform a powerful group attack without taking any turns from other party members. However, this command needs to be replenished by fighting more battles. Fighting is something you'll be doing quite often, as the encounter rate is quite high. You can expect to be running into a battle every 8 seconds or so, which is especially aggravating whenever you're sailing on board your ship. Since the setting is a chain of islands, the primary means of traveling is sailing. Unfortunately for Suikoden 4, sailing is easily the worst part of the game. Your ship's default speed is quite slow, so holding the R1 button to speed things up both on sea and land is mandatory. In fact, this should be the default sailing speed. What makes sailing truly painful is, like I just said, you'll be fighting constantly. All of the random encounters make sailing from one island to another take infinitely longer, especially if you had the misfortune of missing an island's port. Logically, it makes sense that you can only land by docking at a port, but if you miss the port and sail near an island, you'll be suddenly pushed away from it by some sort of force field of psychic energy. This can be really annoying when trying to circle around an island, trying to get to a port, only to be fighting the controls as you constantly are being pushed away. Navigating from one island to the next is also a painful process since the draw distance is way too short for aiding in finding your next destination. This is painfully apparent when trying to find a new island, as they won't be visible until you're right next to one. Also, islands you haven't visited yet will not be shown on the map, which further makes navigation all the more infuriating and time-consuming. This makes Vicky, the reoccurring character that handles fast travel in the Suikoden series, a godsend, but sailing is still a considerable part of the game and makes for some segments of the game to take much longer than they should. Ships have more use than just serving as a means to get from point A to B. Ship battles are essentially the replacement to army battles. Like the army battles from Suikoden 2, ships move on a grid, with the goal being to get an enemy ship within your own ship's attack range. Once in range, you'll be firing your ship's rune cannons, which can sink or damage enemy ships. Before naval battles, you'll be assigning a captain to your ship, which influences movement and defense. You'll also need to assign party members with runes to rune cannons, which designates which type of rune shells your ship will fire. You can also organize party members into boarding parties and remaining members as underlings to influence your ship's speed and health. Most of the strategies in these conflicts are determined by how you balance each ship. While naval battles fit the setting quite well, and there isn't anything wrong with the system, I prefer the previous game's means of handling large-scale conflicts. Duels once again return and have remained largely unchanged. Suikoden 4 also introduced a crafting system in which you'll use materials gained through regular gameplay or through trading posts to forge superior armor and accessories. Overall, the battle system, naval battles, and town exploration are relatively fun and have no glaring issues, but the high encounter rate and sailing really make some sections a complete chore to play. The sailing especially is a fun killer. If you have the patience to get over sailing, the rest of the gameplay can be enjoyable. While the game's visuals are indeed an improvement from Suikoden 3's, the game still looks worse amongst other games released in the same span of time. I'm also not much of a fan of artist and designer Yukono Kawano's character designs. In my opinion, pale in comparison to the character design from previous games. Environments and character models look okay. Sailing on the sea, as I mentioned earlier, suffers from a small rendering distance and kinda looks bland in general with not much to see but water. Character animations look a bit stiff and awkward, which is really apparent during the main character's walking animation cycle. Overall, while better technically to Suikoden 3's visuals, Suikoden 4 merely looks okay at best, especially given its time of its release. In the end, the game hasn't aged all that well visually. As per usual, the game is quite strong in the sound department, and I actually really like the game's soundtrack. It's distinct from previous game soundtracks due to the setting, with many songs incorporating more wind-based instruments. Suikoden 4 is the first game in the series to feature voice acting, which is really well done for the most part. Overall, the game really shines in the sound department, and I can't say I have any complaints. At the end of the day, I would say Suikoden 4's reputation as being the weakest game in the main series is well deserved. It's by no means a bad game, but it suffers from featuring some of the worst sailing I have ever experienced in a video game. It also has a brief but underwhelming story that is unable to develop the majority of its characters. Aside from the sailing, the gameplay is solid, if a bit easy overall. While the game is no graphical showcase, the visuals do their job and look okay. The game does feature a really good soundtrack that I would recommend giving a listen, even if you don't plan on playing the game itself. Sadly, Suikoden 4 will be the first game of the series I can't really recommend. Only the most patient of gamers will be able to fully enjoy it. For everyone else, there are simply better games in the Suikoden series I'd recommend over this first. If you're interested in giving this game a shot, you'll have to do so on a PlayStation 2, as the game has not seen a digital release on the PlayStation Network, and it is unknown if it will ever happen. The average price online for this game varies between $15 to around $30, so it remains relatively inexpensive in comparison to the other Suikoden games. Well, that's all for now, but I'm not truly done with Suikoden 4 just yet. I hope you'll join me for part 5 of the Suikoden Retrospective, in which I'll be looking at the prequel and sequel to Suikoden 4, Suikoden Tactics. As always, it's been Darren the Gaming Pilgrimage. Till next time. Well, it looks like the channel's on a regular schedule again. Thank you all for your patience before now. We have 3 videos left this Suikoden Retrospective, with Suikoden Tactics, then Suikoden 5, then Suikoden Terracris, or Techris, or however the hell you say the DS game's name. So we'll have those coming up soon. So that entails that a new Retrospective will be on the way in the coming months, so be sure to comment on which series you'd like to see me take a look at whenever that happens. Thanks for watching, and catch you next time.